Their idea was to start an actual national socialist revolution through street violence. We have to make our environment so violent, the system gonna crush itself. We actually believed in the idea that the Russian state crushed them to the end and they will never came back. But when the war started in 2022, they came back in the full power. Yeah, I fought, I spilled my blood, and now I have a right to be in power, to be in charge. That's how it worked like in Germany. That's how it worked in Ukraine. And this is how it's gonna be in Russia.
You're listening to This Authoritarian Life, a podcast in which we explore everyday human stories to make sense of authoritarian politics. My name is Krzysztof Sombati.
And I'm Erdem Evran. This episode was sponsored by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and was produced in cooperation with the International Research Group on Authoritarianism and Counter-Strategies.
So welcome back to the show. The first thing I have to say is that unfortunately my co-host and friend Erdem had to fly to Istanbul on a very short notice, so I'll be doing this episode on my own. And concerning the topic of the episode, so last time we talked about the destructive power of psychic energies. We talked about Israel and the US and the role of resentment and fear in authoritarian politics. And given that Israel was one of the main topics, war came up as a central kind of focus of the podcast. And in today's podcast, we'll also get to war and talk about violence, but we're going to be looking at the power of ideas and movements, and unfortunately also war. And we're going to be looking at Russia, which is a very interesting space, I think, for three reasons. The first is that ultranationalist and fascist ideas emerged after a regime that wanted to eradicate these ideas was in place for a very long time, several decades. I think it's just interesting to look at how these movements and ideas reemerge and how they occupy social space and grab people. The second thing is that I think in Russia, the far-right scene was one of the strongest. Globally speaking, it was a very relevant and strong scene with tens of thousands of mostly young men involved and, well-networked and whatnot. So I think it's just very interesting to investigate the power of that scene. And the third, and we definitely want to get to it and not get bogged down, is that the war in Ukraine had a very interesting and unexpected consequence for the far right. I say unexpected because we would expect a war to unite the Russian kind of whatever we call far-right scene, so ultranationalists and pan-Slavists, we'll get to these, and other forces and outright neo-Nazis, but there was actually interesting splits and realignments in that space due to the war. So instead of it coming together, it kind of seems to be having internal fights. And so we thought that would be also very interesting to look at. And to do this, we have someone who is very well placed to address all of these themes that I've just touched on. His name is Arkadij. It's a pseudonym that I will use because we need to protect his identity. So what I can tell you about Arkadij is that he lived for a long time in Russia. He was an anti-fascist activist and a journalist. And he moved away with his family from Russia some time ago to Western Europe because he no longer felt safe back home. But the point is that he has a lot of personal experience to share on this and has also written about this, which I also don't want to say much more about, but there's also heavy thinking going on here. So thanks for coming on the show, Arkadij. We're very, very happy to have you here.
Thank you, Krzysztof, for inviting me.
Thanks for being here. So let's start personal. Can you say a few things about where you grew up in Russia?
Yeah, that's the tricky part because what people from the West don't understand, that the Russian people and the Russian ethnic people are just different names. And we do understand because in Russian language there are two different words for it, which is Россияне and Русские, which means Russian and Russian ethnicity, which are 90% of the total population, the white majority Orthodox Slavic people, and the Russian as a name of a nation, which includes also the small Muslim nation where I came from, like Caucasian republics and small tribes on the Far East. So I grew up in the late USSR and a small national republic, and we are really small in numbers right now, just 2 million. Then when the Soviet Union collapsed, our family moved to Moscow, and I grew up among the white Russians. And then I realized that I'm something different because people have been asking me, who are you, where I came from. I met some of these, prejudices and experienced, but I can't say people were really angry at me. It wasn't like that. I'd say just the way I realized I'm totally different. But I never practiced any kind of different religion. It's not that sharp among my people, and Russian people are not really religious because of the USSR experience. But yeah, I grew up with the feeling that ethnicity, your nation, is something really important that other people pay attention to. And then I tried to learn it, and I understood that it's something really tricky.
You didn't mention exactly where you came from. Let's just mention it nevertheless. So what is this republic?
Yeah, so I grew up in Bashkortostan, and we actually had the same kind of a small nations conflict between Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. They're really quite the same. I mean, we speak the same language, we share the same cuisine, and that's how I realized this total Russian-Ukrainian conflicts just totally between neighbors. When you share the same space, you try to get into the conflict with your neighbor over common things, like the soup, borscht. Ukrainians say borscht is their soup, Russians say it's ours, and now we've got a war. Now, of course, it's not about borscht. There's something behind it.
And how was your move to Moscow? So how was it for you coming from this background to arrive to Moscow and live there?
Yeah, so maybe that's the best part of being part of the Soviet heritage, because they try to get rid of this nations, ethnical difficulties and borders, and they try to blend in people and construct a new Soviet identity, which is quite good. Then they stopped doing all of this Muslim things. It's not that hardcore as in Caucasian republics. And we realized that through the Chechen wars in the first 90s, when Soviet Union collapsed and Russian Federation came after one of this thug republic of Chechnya. Chechnya tried to gain its independence from the general Russian Federation. They declared independence and they came after them, and this religion fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, thrived in Chechnya, but never in other regions of Russian Federation. Ural Mountains republics are just normal people. We drink vodka, eat pork, nobody gives a shit. But in Chechnya and other Caucasian republics, more of radical Islam came and it became really popular.
Mm. Did this war in Chechnya in a way impact you in the sense, did it touch you? Were you othered? Were you treated as someone, potentially, circumspect, dangerous? You were still a child, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But the war came into our home with these terrorist attacks when they bombed buildings. And the whole living building just crashed with all of these residents, 200, 300 corpses. And these notorious terrorist attacks like we had last year, Crocus City Hall, when the group of terrorists just came into the theater and gunned down everybody and bombed the whole place. So people were terrified back there. And maybe that's the way how this new Russian identity was constructed through this nightmarish 90s and terrorist attacks. And when Putin came to power in the beginning of the noughties, zeros, 2000s, we say, he became as a true liberator, the true defender of a nation, because he's a FSB officer. And he said, okay, we're going to hand down every terrorist in every corner. Like if we found them in the toilet, we're going to kill them there in the toilet. It was his literal word.
How old were you?
Yeah, I was like 15 or something. And I do remember myself because he was like, Putin was really young and like a strong leader. My mother bought me like a book for school with his face. And there was like a national anthem for the very beginning. Like I never heard it, but they played it in a school and I stood up. But nobody stood up. I was like, yeah, I'm proud like to be a part of like our Russian nation. And I'm proud to have like a young president in power. He's gonna like save us and he's gonna defend us. And yeah, we're gonna thrive for that. And that's how I learned how to be a Russian, maybe how to become a part of this like a biggest like sense of being part of a big nation. And Putin gave it to people, and he gave like a hope. After nightmarish 90s, it was actually good. And yeah, he was still young back there and like beautiful, doing sports, and PR agencies made a really good portrait of young Putin. Then I'm telling you honestly, like everybody was like obsessed with him. And I do remember when Western media was like asking, putting his face on the cover and like, who is Mr. Putin? He was like young FSB officer, fresh out of this corrupted post-Soviet elite who tried to like rebuild our country into like brighter future, who gonna bring us to like a hope, pave a new way for a new generation. And we kind of believe in that. We kind of bought this idea. The first 10 years of Putin's regime was actually really successful because on one hand we have high prices on oil and gas, and Russia's economy flourished. We had this oil money, and they actually paved this word. They put it in the media like oil dollars, nefti dollary. And we could buy cheap stuff from the West, computers, cell phones came. The Russian people could easily travel to Turkey and have a good rest there. Like for middle-class Russian family, is to rest somewhere in the Turkey or Middle East was like the normal way to spend money. Right now, it's impossible because the ruble went down, the political restrictions came, the sanctions came. Actually, we're really poor.
From what you said, I understood that he came with this promise, which he sort of delivered on, to defend the country and the nation in the face of this terrorist threat. And you also mentioned that there was economic prosperity for the middle class, at least. Was this idea of national greatness already present and important as a third element to his success, or was that in the beginning not really so important in his regime and politics?
Yeah, that's the greatest question we ask ourselves. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was an ideological vacuum. And the first president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, he came up with the idea of actually inventing a new national idea. They made like a open call. So everybody can go with his idea, what's our new national idea going to be. And it was on the Russian newspaper, which is official state newspaper. There was like a prize, $1,000, maybe more. And people kept sending them like their different ideas. And it's fucking failed. Nobody understood what's going to be our new national idea. And then when Putin came to power, he began to make new experiments in the ideological field. And he invited Chechen man, Vladislav Surkov, and he helped him to construct a new idea of a new Russia. So it was something from the past. He managed to unite the idea of great Russia of the Tsarist period and the Soviet era. He united it all in one continuous line of great Russian nation, of great Russian state, who constantly fought against West and the East, but flourished. And now it's time for a new leader to kind of combine all of these elements and put on top of that the great victory of 1945. And he found it. He found the very essence of every Russian family that united all of us. There is nothing like Soviet Union collapsed. You have to understand it's gone. The idea of communism, of the state planned economy, of internationality, of cosmos, of the conquering space is gone. There is nothing. They stole everything from us. New capitalist class came and they stole our assets, our factories, our lands. There is nothing to be proud of. But Putin came, and with the help of Vladislav Surkov, who has great theater education, he's actually a theater guy, he came up with the idea, what if we gonna give people this essence, like a little bit of proudness? You are a generation of grandsons of people who actually defeated Germany, Nazi Germany, and you fought with them. And we're gonna give you a literal band which gonna unite all of you, your grandmothers and granddads who fought there and died, and you are the generation who gonna continue this victorious line. And it's actually a literal band. It's called St. Georgian Ribbon, black and orange, which kind of resembles this prize for being in the army in 1945. And the Russian people started to wear it with great proudness. Like, my granddad was there under Volgograd. He died in 1942, and I'm really proud of him. And I'm still have this idea, and I want my kids to know about it, because there was a fucking war, and 27 million people died there, and we paid a great price. And now what the Russian state did, they gave you a literal ribbon to wear. Don't worry about your money being stolen by capitalists, but wear this and you've got something to be proud of, at least.
Did you see this as having an effect in your own social circle? So did people go with this, who surrounded you or who you were in contact with?
Yeah, it was actually a big battle. I do remember how it started. It was coined by a media manager of the great state news agency. She invented this idea, and she had
You mean the idea of the ribbon?
Yes. She had a prize, and then people started to wear it. First, it started as the cars-only action. People kind of tied it to the antenna of the car. But then they started to put it somewhere on your clothes, on weird places. And there were different pictures of young people wearing it all over the place, really, making fun of it. But then, through years, people realized it's actually something sacred, and you can't place it on your shirt. Just put something on your chest. Go on 9th of May, take part in this victory parade, have a picture of your granddad who fought against Germany. And yeah, it's a great idea. I mean, that's why people love Putin, because he actually managed to coin the new essence of being a Russian man, being really poor but proud at the same time. And it's all spoiled with the blood of the previous generations who fought. And this idea of having a future war, it's always there. I mean, let's start from the beginning. Actually, the Russians are the biggest nation of Europe. There are more than 100 million Russians. When Russian far-right people say, oh, yeah, we are so belittled by others, it's not that true. I mean, the Russians are the biggest nation on the continent. And they kept fighting for years for the state to exist. And they coined this identity of being constant soldiers, like we're forever soldiers. We have to fight against Europe, for example. There is constant threat from the West. They will go after us with Nazi Germany, with Polish people, with Hungarian people, or there are like these hordes from the East. So we have to be in constant state of awareness. We are the military nation, they said. Like it's when the Russian-Ukrainian war started, they put Alexander the Great, Tsar, and his phrase, "We are not the nation of traders. We are not the nation of farmers. We are the nation of the soldiers." So this idea of always preparing ourselves to the next war, it was always there with these military parades, with this memory of the Great War. I'm not proud of it. I live in a constant fear.
What you said about the ribbon, I mean, it very strongly resonates with my experience from Hungary. And we also have a ribbon in the colors of the national flag, red, white, and green. This was very strongly connected to the idea of national independence and the revolution of 1848, where we fought for independence from the Habsburgs. And Orbán was the first to try successfully to use this as a political instrument for propaganda purposes, basically saying that it's only our right side of the political spectrum that is truly patriotic and has the right to use and demonstrate with this symbol, because there is a part of the nation that is anti-patriotic, unfortunately, who doesn't, want national greatness to thrive because maybe they are in cahoots with Western or, other foreign powers. So I guess the question that poses itself is, was there also with Putin immediately also this element of, yes, we're a great nation and we are soldiers and we should be proud of that, but that there are also enemies within our ranks? Did that emerge also immediately, or did it take time?
Yes, actually, that's quite new. So it's actually happened after 2014, because before that, they thought we're going to have a good business with the West. So why fight against them? But yeah, after 2014, we understood that the fight between, let's say, American Western type capitalism and this Russian statehood is just too strong. They can't do it together. They can't have this nice and cheap stuff from the West and the war with Ukraine on one hand. So they have to go after each other. So yeah, let's roll into another world conflict. Let's have another international capital war.
Before continuing and talking about the war, which would be the logical next step since you're already mentioning it, I want to go back into Russia and look at this other kind of far-right space, which we haven't addressed so far, but which you also know a lot about and which is important, I think, too, which is not so much built on this idea of national greatness, but of ethnic and racial greatness and supremacy and superiority. So we can call it neo-fascism, neo-Nazism. I don't know how we want to call it. You'll tell me. But these are kind of the shock troops and the paramilitary groups and the street gangs that you, if I'm not mistaken, encountered already in your teenage years. I'm just going to ask you to kind of talk a bit about them to understand their role and place in all of these big, fights around nationhood and geopolitics, because they clearly also are players now. But let's look at their emergence. So back to your adolescence, who were these people and what were their ideas?
That's a really good question, because now it's not that obvious how it's connected to the Putin's regime and the whole Russian idea. So when Soviet Union collapsed, there was an ideological vacuum and people tried to put something new. Because, the whole idea of just making money doesn't make people really proud. And we lost through 90s 27 million people, just the same amount we lost through the Second World War. that means people were really depressed. They kept, killing themselves, especially like the males. I mean, for us, for Russians, it's the most acute question. Like, you're really poor. There's nothing to be proud of. It's the dead end. All you can do is just to sit on your ass, drink vodka, and kill yourself. And that's how Russia became leader of the male suicides on this planet. And we have to keep it in mind, because it's really vast land of like depression and emptiness, and I am still feeling it. And on the other hand, there are some people who try to like put something in this vacuum. For example, like the idea of being a true Russian son. In the 90s, we opened our borders, our economy to anew, and this cheap like stuff from the West came into the country with computers, laptops, cell phones, and nationalism. And of course, we imported the neo-Nazi skinhead subculture, which is quite weird. But there were like first Russian music neo-Nazi bands, and it was quite popular there among youngsters, because they keep looking for a new way to establish themselves in the society. There were no pioneer organization or young communist organization. Criminals came, people been killing each other for money. For example, in Tatarstan was a big thing, and they shot a great TV show about it last year. So yeah, I'm a youngster. I'm 14 something. So what should I do? And I've got this neo-Nazi skinhead subculture. It's so cool. They've got sharp clothes, good music, and I can drink beer and blame somebody for my faults. And through Chechen wars, it was the Caucasian people. I mean, that's weird part, because for Westerners, Caucasian means white people, but in Russia, it's actually quite the opposite. Caucasians means the great enemy of all Russian people, because state propaganda constructed this face of really angry Chechen warrior with his black beard and his dark skin with a big knife who wants to kill our families. And that's how youngsters became really afraid of Caucasian people. I mean, people from Caucasian republics. And they actually coined this word, and they put it on media, Caucasian nation face. And police started to hunt down precisely these people. Like you go on the street and you see somebody who looks different. If it's Caucasian, that means maybe he has a gun or a bomb, or he sells drugs, whatever. He's a threat. And yes, through Chechen wars, this idea of ideal enemy to Russian people was constructed. And it was so beautiful for the Russian neo-Nazi skinheads. They started to beat and hunt down the people from the Caucasian republics. And then the migrants from the Middle Asia came from Middle Asian countries, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan first, because after Soviet Union collapsed, their economy was crashed and they had their own civil wars. They all came to Russia to earn something for their families. And of course, they do cheap labor. They still do it. But this far-right Russian people say, okay, they're stealing our jobs. They came to rape our women. We have to get rid of them. And that's through that one, we're going to rebuild our fortress, Russia, back again, our great nation, blah, 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 whatever. Yeah, it's quite stupid, but it's actually there, and it was quite popular in the 90s, and the state doesn't have anything against them. They never prosecuted these people. The neo-fascists actually took part in defense of White House in 1993, Barkashov people. It was the biggest far-right organization, Russian National Unity, RNE. But then RNE kind of crumbled apart. They have actual swastika as their symbol. And they gave momentum to new far-right organizations. So through 90s, all of those far-right people flourished. They built new communities around the whole Russia, which is quite big. And when Putin came to power, Surkov and these elites, they realized they could use it. Because through Boris Yeltsin era, this far-right organization was just like, we don't care about them, let them do their thing. But when Putin came to power, he realized these far-right people are actually useful. We can use them as a street soldiers against these colorful revolutions, which happened everywhere in these post-Soviet republics. And they all been happening in the same way. Like a bunch of people came onto the central square, they put tents, they shouted, and then they waited until the current government is gone. So they say, okay, we have to get rid of these things. We have to prevent it. So they managed to put money into the youngsters' politics, they say. They actually started the biggest pro-state, pro-loyal youngster organization called the Ours, Nashi. And their first name was Young Anti-Fascist Democratic Movement. And they put anti-fascist word there. But on the very core, on the very essence, on the very centrum of the whole organization were the far-right hooligans from the soccer hooligan teams from CSKA and Spartak. And they've been hunting down the opposition parties. They beat people from NBP Limonov party and other new young liberals. They've been doing this dirty job for them. But it was the anti-fascist word which was in the name of the bigger organization, because Surkov realized that maybe anti-fascists, doing the same job as our granddads and our grandmothers did in the great victory. That's the way we're going to unite all of the people. But in the reality, it was the far-right idea and the far-right people who've been doing this job. Young people in the same clothes marching on the streets of the big cities of Russia. Through notice, they built this movement. They gave money to new different groups, like there was like ecological movement, Mesnaya, and that's how they got rid of the whole idea of the new colorful revolution in Russia, because if somebody gonna come like these pro-Western liberals and they're gonna protest, we're gonna invite these far-right hooligans and they're gonna physically block them of entering this central square of Moscow, for example. And they're going to prevent this colorful revolution. And this strategy worked out beautiful. But then the Pandora box was opened. In 2010, these far-right hooligans themselves came to Manezhny Square of the Moscow, that's the central square, and they started a big riot, like blood riot, because their comrade was killed by a Caucasian guy. They say, okay, police investigation never found out who it was. It was Yegor Sviridov. Yegor Sviridov was a true Russian son. We have to avenge. They came to Manezhny Square. They started to fire. They started to, throwing things, like putting police cars on fire. And Kremlin elites realized far-right can't be controlled. They're too dangerous. They have to be, kept in a box. From 2010 to 2014, they crushed all of them, just in one moment, like that. Police repressions are the best tool for the Russian state. They do it beautifully. They put everybody in the prison. The biggest nationalist movements as the DPNI, the movement against illegal immigration, which was so big and good, and they had every chapter in every big city. They just arrested all of them, put in the prison. Phew, they're gone. So that's how we realized that all of those far-right people are so convenient to be used by the state as a brute force, as a street soldiers, as infantry against enemy of the state.
So did these groups then have their own kind of autonomous agenda? Because I understand that they were being used by the regime in this way that you just explained. But what was the agenda of these people then? So can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, so that's quite interesting because we've been studying them for years. So let's say the biggest nationalist organization back in the day was DPNI, the movement against illegal immigration. They were like, okay, we are general nationalists. We are defending the rights of the Russian nations. We want our jobs back. these markets and cheap labor are occupied by the Caucasians and the migrants from the Middle Asia. So we have to get rid of that. And it was quite good. I mean, the common Russian people who were really angry after being poor in the 90s, they caught this idea and they started to manifest their anger on these poor people, poor migrants. That's how it works in all countries. But on the same hand, it was like the general nationalist organization. We had this like typical far-right neo-Nazi groups, and they did actual terrorist attacks. Like 2009 was a peak murder year. They committed more than 520 murders.
Against
like normal people, against like, you know, males from Caucasian republics, against Muslims, gay people, of course. So that's the idea I want to explain. Okay, so you've got this big nationalist rise, okay? Some general population bought this idea, but the youngsters are more radical than them. They want something like bigger. They aim for the bigger ideas. And that's how 2-3% of this general national audience came into the real radical ideas, and they started to forge their own terrorist groups, like the National Socialist Society. They had a really weird connection to the Russian state special services, and they said it out loud. Okay, we have our big brother. And they were military trained, they had guns, and they like started to kill people with with weapons. But their idea was to start an actual national socialist revolution through street violence, and they put it like that on the table. We have to make our environment so violent, the system gonna crush itself, and through that we're gonna have this Russian National Socialist Revolution. It's weird, but these people, they still believe in this idea. And the violence became an actual core for all of these far-right Russian organizations. When the Ukrainian war started, leaders of the National Socialist organization went to Ukraine, and they joined the Ukrainian forces, and they helped to establish Azov.
Now, this is the interesting moment, because here we see this tension, right, between these two factions of what we call the far right, the kind of greater Russia front who is with Putin, and then these more neo-fascist, neo-Nazis who kind of who have other ideas. So what explains that they go against the great Russia Putin thing?
Yeah, that's really weird, but I'm trying to explain it. So from 2010 to 2014, Russian state crushed all of those far-right movements. They were completely gone, and the Ukrainian war completely put an end to this general far-right community we had in Russia. And the most like neo-Nazi, the most Hitlerist, the most far-right people, they went to Ukraine. As, for example, the Born group, terrorists, killed our comrades, Stanislav Markelov and Anastasia Baburova, just in the center of Moscow, just gunned them down, and they go on in Ukraine to hide there.
What is this group?
Born, which is a combat organization of Russian nationalists. They had their own legal face, the Russian image, which was constructed after Serbian image. So through that way, they had these international connections. Of course, Ukraine was the destination number one, and they've got a lot of different interstate connection and ties. You know, the hiding was the first thing to do for Russian nationalists, to hide in Ukraine. And they came to Ukraine as they helped to establish these first paramilitary groups. Okay, were Russian nationalists fighting for Ukraine against Russian state? Why? They say, okay, the Russian state was, the power was captured by anti-Russian people, by Bolsheviks, and they want to rebuild the Soviet Union once again. Vladimir Putin is just FSB officer. He had this idea of the great Soviet Union, the new version of Soviet Union, okay? That's why they kept Chechnya and they kept giving money to Chechnya, all of those small republics. That's why they crushed the national movement of Russians in Russia. That's why they never gave a Russian nation a title status. Because right now, Russia is a multi-ethnical state. Nobody is the main nation right there. But since Russians are 90% of the whole population, they want to have this, we are the title nation. We are entitled to run our own state. But Putin, that's their idea, but Putin is the main border between the far-right people and they're achieving their idea of becoming a title nation of Russia. So they said, okay, we have to fight for our homeland, and we're gonna win our homeland back by joining Ukrainian forces, which is quite weird. But in their far-right community, it was quite common. And of course, on the other hand, we've got this, let's say, the imperialists. They say no. They say no. That's the Russian state that we have to fight for. It's not the Russian nation, but the state itself. We have to preserve it. Or if we lose, Western powers gonna come again and they're gonna destroy our country, which happened in 1917 through October Revolution. They still believe that Lenin was a German spy. Or in 1993 when the Soviet Union collapsed. So for them, it's just the idea of preserving the continuous Russian state. It's not the National Socialist Revolution, whatever. So it was a big fight, and people who were uniting in their hatred against the other started to shoot each other. And even they were in the same organization, like the National Socialist Society. It was Sergei Korotkych. He's like the most interesting case. Sergei Korotkych was working for the state in Belarus, State Security Service, then in Russia. Then he he made his close friend, the most well-known neo-Nazi skinhead of Russia, Maxim Marcinkiewicz. He forged a case against him and he managed to put him in a prison. But then when the Russian state started to hunt down the Russian nationalists, he fled to Ukraine. He joined the paramilitary forces and he helped them to forge Azov movement. And actually, what I'm trying to say, the Azov movement itself, the Ukrainian nationalists in the very core, they are Russian-speaking people with Russian neo-Nazis in charge.
So let me just try to summarize or make sense of what you were saying. The key moment seems to be 2014, when the real racialists and ethnicists in Russia, so that part of the far right, which is about ethnic supremacy and racial supremacy, they realize that Putin's regime is not going far enough in elevating kind of ethnic Russians to this title status, as you say. And not only that, but going against them. So there's a break between the regime and this flank of the far right, right? And you're saying they escape to different places in Europe, but really find a place in Ukraine where they link up with the local elements of the also racialist, ethnicist far right, right?
Yeah.
And they want to reoccupy Russia because they think it's been occupied by someone who pretends to be a nationalist but really isn't. And then there's this other group of people who are like, wait a minute, but the really important thing is who occupies the state, because that's the main danger to Russian nationalism when the West comes in to occupy the state, because then we're decimated. So we need to protect those who control the levers of political power and stand with them, because then we will protect the grandeur and future of the Russian nation. Did I get that right?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a little bit of peculiarities. For example, we've got on the Russian side this far-right group called the Russian Imperial Movement, and they are fighting on the Russian side, but they are against Putin. They are neo-monarchists or hardcore Orthodox people who are actually praying on the battlefield, putting these sacred images of the god on their chest breastplates. but they are against Putin. They say, okay, he's the red devil, but we have to defend our homeland against the Western hell, gay Europa, whatever. And of course, we've got on the Ukrainian side, the most prominent example of this idea is the Russian Volunteer Corps by Denis Kapustin, who kind of repeated the way of Sergei Korotkov, the botsman. He is a far-right hooligan from Russia who was raised in Germany in Jewish family. Then he came to Russia. He managed to establish his own MMA business, White Rex, and like a fighting championship for far-right people. All of these far-right nationalists who right now fight on the Russian side, they actually took part in his championship. It's just, martial arts thing, whatever. Then European Union banned him in Europa. Russian state also banned him in Russia, and he came to Ukraine because he got nowhere to go. He tried to establish his connections in this far-right environment of the Ukraine, which kind of flourished there, under the surveillance of Ministry of Internal Affairs. And there was a minister, Avakov, but Avakov was in charge of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and he helped all of those Russian far-rights to get into the Ukraine and get the actual Ukrainian passports. He helped Sergei Korotkov to have his passport from the hands of Petro Poroshenko, president of Ukraine back in the days. So this far-right community flourished in Ukraine. They started his paramilitary thing. And Denis Kapustin, when the war started, he tried there and there. He established his own group. They've got weapons from the Western countries. They've got landmines, like the tanks, even military vehicles. They've got military training. They've got support from the Ukrainian state. And the Ukrainian state been using Russian Volunteer Corps in this Kursk Oblast operation when they raided these border regions.
Recently, yes, a few months ago, successfully.
Yeah, it was quite successful for them. Because they said, okay, it wasn't like the true Ukrainians, it was the Russian volunteers who tried to win back their homeland. And they've been using the same line, we're fighting against neo-Bolshevism. You have to understand that they still into this old war of the white movement of the great October Revolution and the Reds, the communists. They really hate us. I mean, they still into the whole idea of we have to stop this like Jewish communists, we have to fight back. Putin is just a new Bolshevik. See, the Russian soldiers are still using the red flags of Soviet Union. They're rebuilding Lenin monuments in Ukraine when they captured the territory. They actually using the victory banner, which was placed in Berlin in 1945. From that way, they say, okay, there is still Bolshevism. We have to fight back, or our white race will be, destroyed. So for this far-right people, Russian people fighting in Ukraine, the whole idea of white race have to be defended. It's there. It's happening right there. That's how the whole far-right community in Eastern Europe, in the whole Europe, I think, was galvanized. And they've been heavily disrupted, heavily divisioned by the Ukrainian war. Some of them joined Ukraine, some of them joined Russia, some of them abstained. But by that, they realized that the whole essence of the far-right ideal is not that solid. It's still unknown who is the whitest of them all, who is the true Russian. Russians fighting on the Russian side or the Russians fighting on the Ukrainian side. So weird.
But it's also interesting to see the incredible power that historical memory and these symbols of history and these old battles, Bolshevism, counter-Bolshevism, I mean, it's 100 years ago, but they still play an incredible role in defining people's identities and their place in this war, right? So, but let's come to then maybe the consequences of this, maybe in looking at Russia. So basically we went to 2014 where Putin decimates this, the whole scene. the whole ethnicist, racialist scene because they are seen to be too dangerous to political stability, right? You mentioned this riot on Moscow's main square, which was the triggering point. But so now with the war, Putin also needs these people to some extent more than he used to, right? So I guess the question that emerges here is, does this give them the more space to recruit, to make their ideas heard, to have a social impact?
Yeah, that's the best question we've got right now on the plate. So the thing is, after 2014, when this actual military conflict on the eastern parts of Ukraine kind of calmed down, we never had the nationalists back there in Russia. There were no far-right people, and that's why all of Russian anti-fascists stopped doing their thing. For 10 years, we never had anything like that. There is something completely new. We actually believed in the idea that the Russian state crushed them to the end and they will never came back. But when the war started in 2022, they came back in the full power. They were energized by the whole idea of having a violent conflict where they can manifest themselves. Maybe that's how nationalism thrives through all of these centuries. Nationalism is the more effective way to mobilize people than the class politics. Class identity is not that simple to understand. People just don't grab the whole idea of being a true worker. That's something you have to achieve through studying Marx, to achieving the class consciousness. But nationalism is something really simple. You say you're Russian, you're Ukrainian, go fight. That's how it works. And when Putin announced the beginning of the war, all of those groups suddenly emerged as the volunteer, and they started to summon money from different strats of the Russian population, send them to the battlefront. And for example, at the beginning of the war, nobody knew that it will be a UAV war. You see, that's what we saw. The new technological advancement is the UAV.
Can you just spell that out? What that is?
Unmanned, the drones.
Unmanned air, the drones, basically.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And then because the Russian state never produced that en masse, and they have to buy it in China, for example. And these nationalist groups, they started to invest money. They actually bought the Chinese drones to put them in the battlefront. Then they combined them with explosives, with cameras, and with their own software. And yeah, it's actually it was quite successful. It's the best strategy they had right now. Then the Russian state captured the whole idea of UAV, started their own factories. In Tatarstan, for example, there is a big one. But yeah, it was these volunteer groups, maybe the same way as in Ukraine. This volunteer group started to make it from the grassroots, because the state was just too big to capture the whole idea of this, having a new type of war where the small units with UAVs gonna kill each other. So yes, they started to summon money to send their own volunteers on the battlefront. Then in 2023, we realized there are capitalists in Russia who are interested in having their own volunteer units, like small private armies. And right now we have a Spagnola unit, which is all far-right hooligans. Not that big, but there's there. That's the oldest. Then we have this weird Russian imperial movement and their own combat wing, which are against Putin himself, but somehow they got their own combat training base in St. Petersburg, and they've got weapons, and they're kind of weird. Actually, not that big. Then Konstantin Malafeev, the right-wing oligarch, who has his shares in Rostelecom. He's a typical oligarch from the 90s, but he started to do his own ideological assault. He's hardcore Orthodox. He managed to assemble his own combat unit called the 106 VDV Moscow Reconnaissance Brigade, which right now has different names, Svetlo Yar. And they invited all of those far-right football hooligans to take part in the war. They gave them weapons. It was Konstantin Malafeev from the beginning who gave them money, like a big money. And if we are talking about small unit, 100 people, you have to understand that each of these soldiers have to be like dressed, have to be trained. There must be a base, like a place to be. So we're talking about big money, actually big assets behind them. And of course, there are some like others, Cossack units. They are not very active in this war for some reason, but of course they are connected to the Russian church, and the Russian church was also kind of involved into that business. So right now we have at least 3 far-right combat units, and I forgot the Rusich. So Rusich unit is the most like prominent one, and leader Alexei Milchakov, he's a straight outspoken neo-Nazi. There was an interview just before the war. He said, "I'm a neo-Nazi. I can have a Nazi salute in this room. It's like, why bother myself?" So through that way, people like were really bamboozled. They were like, okay, so you've got Nazis fighting with Soviet Union flags, red flags against like other Nazis in Ukraine. This is so weird. But we have to understand that's the dangerous part. There are capitalists like after them. They are supporting them. They give them money, and after the war, they gonna turn them into the private armies. And these like ex-soldiers, these veterans, they want to have their piece of power. They said, "I spilled my blood there in Ukraine, in the fields of Donbass. I'm here, I returned, I lost my limb. I want to have a party, nationalist party." That's how it worked in Ukraine. Because all of these Azov veterans, they started their own political wing. They never had more than 3%. But this ex-veteran sentiment, the feeling of, I fought, I spilled my blood, and now I have a right to be in power, to be in charge. That's how it worked like in Germany. That's how it worked in Ukraine. And this is how it's going to be in Russia. And maybe that's the most dangerous thing. They're going to build a new nationalist party. They're going to win there. And they're going to build big, strong, and really dangerous Russia with true hardcore Orthodox nationalist agenda. Maybe that's the most dangerous scenario we're going to have.
So right now, these street thugs are on the front line, right? They're not present right now on national soil, so to speak.
Oh, no, actually, they are so visible right now.
They are?
I'm sorry, maybe I was too focused on the battlefront because it's really acute. So what's happening right now in Russia, they've got a new, I'd say, third generation of Russian nationalists. And maybe that's the most important thing that we have to understand as like independent researchers. Because it was never a thing for 10 years. And suddenly, out of nowhere, 2 major nationalist organizations emerged, the Russian community and the Northern Men.
Northern Men.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that's so weird. It is run by a really crappy rap songwriter, Misha Mavashi, who was in the Russian nationalist community before that. But he was like doing this straight edge thing. We are against drugs, against alcohol. But then he went into rehab himself, and he started his own Russian nationalist organization. They're really loyal to the state. They got funding. I'm sure they've got funding through these quirky foundations of local like companies. For example, the Northern State is connected to the Voronezh construction company, and they are aimed on the youngsters because they are kind of connected to this rap music, and they visit stadiums and soccer events together. And the other one, the Russian community, is more for the old people, like the 40-something males who got like really poor, nothing to do. They never went to the battlefront, but they coined the term, we have to fight our own internal enemy. They say, okay, Russia is fighting right now on both fronts, outside and inside. Outside is Ukraine, obviously, and the West. But inside, we've got the migrants. We've got the LGBTQI people who want to destroy Russian family, the Russian church. The Russian community started as an anti-abortion, pro-Orthodox hardcore group, and they provided weapons and the funding for the units on the battlefront. But then they found their way among this Russian 40, 50-something males, and they started to do their own vigilante thing. Like they say, there is a red button in our application, SOS, press it, and we're going to help you to fight against these pesky migrants. Their idea is to construct the Russian diaspora in the Russian state, which means the Russian people are in danger. Like the Russians are the majority of the Russia. It's 90%. It's more than that. It's 100 million people. But they say, we are endangered. We have to be protected against these Muslim migrants. Because, through Soviet Union, they kind of erased our Russian identity. We became weak. We became so unorganized through, communist regime. Now we have to assemble back into the body of the Russian state itself, the body of the nation, rebuild back our diaspora. For example, they have on Telegram, they have more than 1 million subscribers, different groups in different cities. They do some community activities. They visit sport events. They do combat military training, martial arts. They do the most dangerous thing. They do raids with police against migrants in St. Petersburg and Moscow. A Russian state propelled this anti-migrant hysteria in 2023. It was head of investigation committee, Alexander Bastrykin himself. He was the biggest friend of the Russian community. He said, okay, there are too many of them. We have to check their documents. Are you here for a reason? Let me check it. And the Russian community kind of started to do this vigilante thing, yeah? It's not legal. They're not police. They don't have any kind of a right to do this thing. But the Russian state, they realized they could be used. Right now, we're monitoring this global far-right resurgence everywhere. It's not only in Russia, but Trump in power, AfD coming up in power here and there, in Hungary. It's everywhere. And in Russia, it manifests itself through these big, loyal to the state organizations. And they say, yeah, once again, there is a historical moment for us to fight back, to win back our homeland.
Yeah. It was also when you were talking about kind of these repercussions within Russia itself, I immediately thought of the U.S. because, we see somehow similar dynamics at play. This anti-immigrant thing is all over the place now. It seems to be the best card to rebuild nationhood in this age of insecurity. It's fascinating to hear that even in a country where 90% of the population is ethnically Russian, you can still successfully have this kind of ideology of a threat, of the internal threat caused by migrants. And I guess what's particular to Russia, thinking, this Trump or US-Russia comparison through is what you just said, that in Russia, the far-right groups are very strongly aligned with the state. I mean, those that stayed, right? Those that didn't migrate elsewhere. Because in the U.S., it's not so much the case, at least until now. It hasn't been. The ICE, the organization responsible within the state to kick so-called illegal immigrants out, is not supported by paramilitary or street thugs for the moment. That may change. But clearly, this anti-immigrant thing then is back, you say, right? So it somehow has a second life now in Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so sorry. I'm starting to gain momentum right now because I'm energized by the whole idea. Let's say, talking about U.S. 2 days ago, there was a new minister of defense in the U.S. Peter Hedge something. Yeah, I don't remember his family name. I'm sorry.
Hexeth, or I can't pronounce it.
Yeah,
either,
me
but
too.
He's the new defense minister.
Yeah, he's the white nationalist, like with his Deus Vult tattoos on his body, with his ex-soldier identity, with his like crazy let's support Christian white males thing. And right now, what they're doing, Trump released out of captivity all of those capital raid white supremacists who were taking part in this action. And right now they're paying money to the loyal citizens who say, okay, we've got the illegal migrants here living, and through that you're gonna have like $1,000 or something. And right now they say they've got these huge raids, anti-migrant raids in different parts of the country, and the same thing is happening in Russia. I think it's kind of, you see, I said at the beginning they're mirroring each other. Even they say, okay, we're against, like, but that's the other side of the mirror. So right now, the whole far-right community was, of course, galvanized by the anti-migrant statement made by the state officials. Alexander Bastrykin himself, and head of the church, said something against that. He said, no, actually, we have to preserve our own Orthodox pro-Russian identity. And through that, which is more interesting for us like activists, okay, we've got these major organizations, they're doing that in this semi-legal space. But there is a Russian far-right neo-Nazi underground, which is thriving right now. And through the second half of 2023, we observed a sudden splurge of neo-Nazi violent videos on Telegram. Like, we never had it before that. Suddenly, like, dozens of these small Telegram channels appeared out of nowhere. They started to attack people on the streets with, for example, the most common thing to see is just to spraying them down with the pepper sprays, or actually beating them down with batons and hands and legs, putting cars on fire, throwing Molotov cocktails on these shawarma places. And they started to organize this through these Telegram channels. They record this video. For them, that's the tool of propaganda, the act of terror itself. You remember I told you about National Socialist Revolution through street violence. They actually repeating this idea right now. And what is interesting, they're against Putin. These far-right people, neo-Nazi people, youngsters, they're only 14, 15 something. They are teenage skinheads, neo-Nazi skinheads. There is the whole neo-Nazi skinhead subculture is gone because it was constructed through music and soccer events. But it's just too old. I mean, nobody listens to that bullshit anymore. But somehow they managed to reappear once again, organize really young people with cool Nazi stuff and put them against the state. They say it was Putin who started the war against neighbors, Slavs killing Slavs, whites killing whites, while they replace our white population with migrants. So they're using the same Western mock idea of the great replacement, but they say they want to get rid of true Russian people on the battlefront to replace them with the migrants from the Middle Asian republics, which is crazy. But they truly believe in that. They truly commit actual acts of murder. And there are a lot of different young groups of teenagers who are really committed to the whole idea of, street violence.
So yeah, it seems to be a new dynamic and a new phase in which, again, there's some autonomous ideas and visions that are not particularly aligned with the regime, or not wholly, only partially. So we see this kind of symbiosis again, in which the far right side has its own agenda. Just as a way to wrap up, another idea that I still want to mention is, which we didn't talk about, but since we have touched on the topic of gender, I mean, it's just impossible not to say that there's masculinity and what you said early about this lack of hope among men, this lack of lives worth living is really somehow very strongly here. And so is, the whole kind of economic devastation of Russia. And I'm sure we'll continue to think about these parallels between far-right movements and ideologies all over the globe, because clearly they're just so interlinked, and there is a network, I think, to think about. It's not a coincidence that we see these kind of very similar ideas emerging in different parts of the globe. There's work behind that. So that's something I think we'll still try to investigate. But Arkadij, thanks very much for being with us.
This episode was sponsored by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and was produced in cooperation with the International Research Group on Authoritarianism and Counter-Strategies.
We would also like to thank our contributors: music and mastering, Shai Levi; artwork and graphics, Polina Georgescu; editing, Vera Jonas; and our in-house communications advisor, Anna Szilágyi.